Well, welcome to today's webinar. I hope you're having a marvelous day. My name is Charles Collegy. I'm your host for today's session, which is incorporating software composition analysis into your secure application strategy. But before we go into the nuts and bolts of application composition, I need to go through the housekeeping for our material. So the first thing is, this is being recorded so that it can be available for on demand. You'll receive an email that tells you the location of it, but should you not get that email, get caught in your spam folder, or you want to just let some colleagues know, you can always just go to devops.com and search for the on-demand webinar components. I also want to go over now our Big Marker platform. Has a lot of interesting components. The first is a live chat, and I just put down my location and where I'm from. Hopefully the rest of you can put down where you're coming from, what you're interested in today, and anything else that comes up during the course of the presentation. If you want to agree, disagree, or add some insight, feel free. We're always monitoring the chat lines and are happy to hear what you have to say. There's a Q&A window, so you can click on that if you want to enter a question that, if we have time, Alex will go through, and we'll try to answer as many as we can before the end of the session. But it's good insight for Rivenera and anyone else who is interested in material. So please put some questions in the Q&A. There is a poll section, so we will be doing some polls in our during the session. And the last part is there's handouts. So there's the presentation deck is available in the handout, and some other material that Rivenera would like you to have for background information and to follow up with. So with that, I'm going to also mention that at the end of the session, there will be a four $25 Amazon gift cards will be awarded. So please stay to the end. We will be announcing who the 4 winners are. So we're going to jump into today's session. Again, it's incorporating software composition analysis into your secure application strategy. Rivenera is our sponsor for today's webinar. And we have with us Alex Rybeck, who is the Director of Product Management, and he'll be taking us along the rest of the way. I'll be in the background taking a look at your chats and the questions, and helping Alex with the polling. But other than that, Alex, back to you, and it's your game now.
All right. Thank you, Charles. And thank you to everybody for joining. Appreciate you spending some time with us today. So this topic is about incorporating software composition analysis into your application security strategy. My name is Alex Rybeck. I'm the Director of Product Management at Rivenera, focusing on our software composition analysis products. I have been in the SCA market for about 15 years now, and really excited about this topic. We always talk about composition analysis. We talk about licensing needs, talk about security kind of in the context of open source. So I'm really excited to broaden the conversation here and talk about application security in general and how SCA is a critical part of that and how it can fit into the overall security process. So as Charles mentioned, really encourage you to ask questions. Please post them in the chat. If anything makes sense as I'm going through this, I'll be happy to address it in line. If not, I'll definitely take questions at the end. And we will be doing a poll because I do want to get your opinion on a few things, and we'll work that into the presentation. Okay, so really kind of 3 topics that I want to focus on in this webinar. Number 1 is quick overview of software composition analysis, how it fits into application security, why it's important, some industry trends, some major events that have occurred over the past couple of weeks. So start by talking about that. talk about specifically impact to the recent cybersecurity executive order by the Biden administration. It's a really big event in this SCA market and in security in general. Really important, something we've been talking about a long time. And now there's some mandates coming out with more to come in the future. So definitely want to make sure to mention that a little bit. And then talk about just a kind of high level view of what an application security program looks like, how software composition analysis fits in, and what are some ways that you can better engage between engineering security teams and your analysts who are doing software composition analysis and have a better relationship with more information sharing across the teams. Okay, so to get started, I wanted to start with security. So we actually had an all hands at our company a few days back, and we had, so as part of our company, so Revenair is part of Flexera, and we are on the software supplier side of the business. So we sell to customers who build software. And on the other side of the house, we have customers that utilize software. And one of our teams is our Secunio research team. They do primary security research, both for open source and commercial components, and their data feeds in directly into our product. And one of the senior software engineers on the team posted an interesting comment in the chat during our all hands, which was that we've issued over 30 zero-day advisories this year, which far supersedes the count from previous years, more than any other year before. And their perspective today is that everybody is essentially at risk of being impacted by a malicious actor. Right, so this is a shift, right? In the past, if you kind of boil it down to why do people hack software, right? Why is there a concern around security? So obviously, number one, money, right? There's ransomware attacks. There's attacks to steal privacy information in hopes of selling it. So money is certainly a driver. There's also disruption, right? People want to perhaps hijack a hardware device by hacking in through software. And we'll talk about some specific examples of that. There's also cases where you just want to be a nuisance, right? You want to perhaps, impact a company's ability to perform their duties, to shut down the organization, to hijack a certain organization that you may have some beef with. We've also seen cases where foreign entities may have a part to play in this. So it's kind of a complex situation. There's a lot of motivated folks. There's also a lot of companies that have a lot to lose. So it's really important to have a grasp on this. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to start off by talking about some bellwether security events that have occurred. Some of these are directly due to open source, others are not, but they're all part of the narrative on what are the different types of attacks, what's the different type of impact, and why this is a really critical subject. So first is probably one of the most well-publicized and marketed open source vulnerabilities. So back in 2012, there was a vulnerability injected into Openssl, which is a security library that is very widely used in the open source community and shows up in lots of proprietary applications. And back in 2014, 2 years later, it was actually publicized as a vulnerability. So the vulnerability was fairly straightforward. It was very easy to exploit. There was clear evidence on the web on how to exploit it and how to use it. It tricked the server into leaking information stored in memory. So it was able to get personal information on a machine by going in through a backdoor in this component. So at the time when this occurred in 2014, there was about 500 million web servers estimated to be impacted, which is almost 20% of the web servers on the internet. So very broad exposure, lots of machines, lots of companies impacted. The issue with this one is we're now 7 years later, and we are still, as part of our audit practice, finding old vulnerable versions of Openssl. So this was by far the most marketed vulnerability out there. Got a nice, pretty logo, had a website dedicated to it, was in lots of publications. Back then, there was a lot of security vulnerabilities, but nowhere near the number today. So there was time to properly write this up, market it, make people aware of it, and still we're seeing evidence that people have not patched. All right, so this is the critical part to understand, is just because, number one, when a vulnerability is publicized, chances are the exploit occurred a long time ago. And number two, you have to patch. If companies are not patching as a result of understanding the exposure, then they're not protecting their customers. And reasons for not patching, either they're not aware or they don't have a process in place to ensure that the remediation work has been done. The second one I want to focus on is Equifax, right? I'm sure everybody's heard of it. The big thing with Equifax was this was a vulnerability due to Apache struts, which is a very common component, had a permissive license. So from an open source licensing perspective, nobody was concerned about it, had a clean bill of health at the time it was used, not an issue. So this was a component that was automatically approved by many people's systems if they had a system in place. This vulnerability allowed hackers to execute malicious commands on remote servers when uploading files to the struts framework. So again, it was fairly easy to exploit. At the time that the vulnerability was published, there was actually a patch already available by Apache Foundation. Very easy fix, just upgrade a jar file to a newer version. And Equifax did not have a process to make sure that was done. Right, so it's kind of another example of similar to the Heartbleed vulnerability where it was fairly straightforward to fix, but absent a process, it was nobody's job to do it. And the consequences everybody's aware of, there's been close to 600 million in fines. Most of the money paid went to banks because they had to deal with the consequences of the breach, people's information getting out, credit reports having to be reissued, millions of people, hundreds of millions of people impacted, close to 146 million. And this was one of the first vulnerabilities that personally impacted people. Other vulnerabilities impact companies. This one, I remember clearly, I was doing a presentation at one of our customers, and everybody started looking at their phone, looking at their credit reports, trying to understand the personal impact to them. So very popular event, really opened a lot of eyes in the software industry on the fact that you need to have a process in place to make sure that you are doing this correctly. Then we get to SolarWinds, right? Everybody obviously has heard of SolarWinds. So SolarWinds was not directly related to open source. It was based on SolarWinds Orion package. This was a supply chain attack. And the supply chain attack is a little bit different in that code is maliciously hacked, right? There's something put into the code. The code is then distributed to a bunch of customers, and then remotely the attacker actually executes the vulnerable code and then can perform malicious acts. And this was the event back in 2020, which really opened up the eyes of government, of every industry, really shook the security industry as to how can this happen. All right, there were foreign entities involved. There were a huge widespread, 18,000 customers were impacted, lots of Fortune 500 companies. So, according to CNBC, close to 425 out of 500 large companies were impacted, accounting firms, military, right? Pentagon, State Department, telco companies, hundreds of universities and colleges worldwide. So everybody was hit with this, and everybody's data center was hit with this, and every CISO got the question of, how can this happen? Are we protecting against the next one? Do we have a robust enough program in place to protect against this in the future? And this really brought cybersecurity to the forefront. Then since then, things kind of keep getting worse. You've got the Microsoft Exchange breach earlier this year. This was a zero-day vulnerability that was exploited. It allowed hackers to bypass authentication, act as an admin. 30,000 organizations impacted. Lots of impacted organizations still have not applied the patch, right? It all goes back to your patching process. Depending on how frequently you're updating Microsoft components, and very often this would be locked down by an organization. If you don't apply the patch, that exploit is still out there and still available. And again, very broad impact to the mass market. And then finally, the last one I really want to talk about is Colonial Pipeline, right? This was a really important one because this was a ransomware attack. There's been many others. You can see the stats below here on who's been impacted by other ransomware attacks. But here, the goal is not necessarily to steal data, but the goal is to essentially handicap the company, right? It's to block a company from being able to run its business until a ransom is paid to unblock that. And we've seen this happening in the medical industry. We'll talk about that in a moment. Here, it was infrastructure, right? It impacted a gasoline company, pipeline company, and impacted airports, impacted military bases, gasoline supplies, and ultimately Colonial paid close to $5 million ransom to get out of this, right? So the point here is you attack for money, you attack for data, you attack for disruption. And it's really important to understand those vectors so you can do a good job of securing your software. The final point I want to make here is we now have evidence that cybercrime is actually a real threat to human safety. There's been a couple of cases late last year and early this year where cybercrime has actually resulted in this case, in the death of a person, and in the second case, an attempt to actually pollute water supply in Florida. So in the first case, there was a ransomware attack in Germany at a hospital, and a patient who was en route to that hospital had to be diverted, and thereby the hospital was unable to accept the patient, and there was a as part of the kind of the redirection of the ambulance, the person ended up passing away. So this is critical, because if you have a hospital get locked down, or you have a government agency get locked down due to a cyber attack, there's really significant impact to them being unable to conduct their business. The second point I want to mention is the attempt to poison the water supply in Florida. So this was a case where a software program that controls how much of sodium hydroxide, which is a chemical that gets put out into water that deals with water cleanliness, how much of that actually gets released into the water supply. And again, in this case, this was a hack to try to take over the hardware that is controlled by the software, and it was effectively executed. So luckily, a supervisor noticed this, was able to manually intervene and stop the process. But now we're talking about pipelines getting hacked, water supply getting hacked, hospitals getting shut down. So you could see that there's really a serious impact to people, and we need to do everything possible to be able to curtail this and to do a better job of securing our software. So I wanted to start with this to kind of explain why we're here, right? So we're here to try to address what are all the different ways we can help solve this issue. So I wanted to switch over and talk about software composition analysis. So software composition analysis is a combination of products and services, so people, product, and process, to help document a company's dependency on open source and third-party software so that they can manage their legal, security, and reputation risk. So today, developers are leveraging open source more than ever before. It's a great way to expedite the delivery of your product to market. It's a great way to make sure that your developers are focusing on the core competence of your business, not spending their time implementing functions that are commonplace, constrained, and well developed by the open source community. So it's something that's leveraged by most, if not all, software companies. When we do audits, and we have an audit practice where we scan customers' code and give them a bill of materials that comes out of there, we typically see up to 80%, and in some cases more, of a commercial application actually comprised of open source as measured by lines of code. All right, so open source is pervasive. It's leveraged by every software company out there. There's nothing intrinsically bad about open source. It just needs to be managed at least as well as you would manage proprietary code with respect to both licensing and security to make sure that your products are clean and the risk is properly mitigated. Okay, so I want to stop here and do a quick poll here. I'll turn it.
So Alex, yeah, this is our audience participation part of the presentation.
Yep.
And just to let the audience know, we have 3 short yes or no questions. So we're going to run through those 3 questions, and then Alex will talk about the results and how it relates to what he sees overall. So the first question we're going to put out here is, does your organization have an open source software policy covering licensing and security? So please answer yes or no. We'll give you a minute, but as we say, there's 2 others following this one. So please keep that in mind. Don't spend too much time pondering your response, and I'll give you like a 20-second or 15-second countdown when we're going to get ready to close it. And I kind of watched to see how the responses are going, and if they keep going, then we keep moving. And but they are slowing down, so I'm going to give it another 15 seconds, and then we'll move on to the next question. So if you'll just bear with us for just another moment, I'll be closing this one in just a second. So get your last answers in. All right, so let's go to the next question. I gotta go back to the queue. It does let me do that. So the next question is, do you know who at your organization is in charge of open source management? And kind of what Alex was talking about with this software composition, where 80% of the applications have open source software. So who's in charge of keeping management of these open source issues? So I guess, Alex, that's, do you always know? Do people always know that they have the open source?
So yeah, I mean, at this point, engineering knows. They're the ones that are asking their build to pull third-party dependencies in. So certainly they're aware that they're using it. We typically, and we'll cover this in the next slide, but we typically see there's a huge gap between the amount that they do know they use and what they actually use. But I think for the most part, most teams at this point acknowledge that they do leverage open source. So the real question is, knowing that, if you had a question, do you know whom to reach out to?
Okay. All right. Well, let's go to the next question, the last one. And we're going to put this one up. Does your organization require all developers to complete open source licensing and application security training? So we'll give you another moment for this one. Maybe a little harder question than the first two. One to have to think about. Did we have training? Do we mandate that? I don't know. We'll have to see. I can tell the answer is a little different than the last two. So Alex will have some fun with these going forward. And we're just going to give it just another minute because we're almost to the same number of responses in all three polls. So just going to give it another 10, 12 seconds, and then I will again go on mute and pass it over to Alex to analyze the results from our polls. So I'm going to close this and move it back to Alex to analyze this and put it in perspective for the rest of his presentation.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate all of you participating. Okay, so let me talk about one of the biggest drivers in open source. So open source, as I mentioned, is very heavily used by all software teams. What we've done over the last 10 years or so is we have conducted an audit of the audit work that we do. So we sample the last 20 or 25 projects that we do every year by our services team. And we compile numbers on what was the level of disclosure going into an audit project versus what were the number of rows in the results that we deliver back to the customer. And you can see back when the numbers are reporting here, so 2012 to 2014, pretty flat. So we're sitting in the low to mid 200s. And then we had an inflection point. So between 2014 and 2016, we doubled the average bill of materials. And that was the time period when package managers became very popular. So in the past, you would have to either statically compile third-party code into your product, or you would have to explicitly ask for a particular dependency to get pulled in. As package manager technology, which is software that helps your build understand what you rely on, and then in turn bring in transit dependencies that your dependencies rely on. So that technology became very popular between 2014 and 16, and today it's kind of the de facto way of building software. And you can see the bill of material increased. And that is because you now ended up not only pulling your dependencies in, but any possible dependencies of your dependencies. So the dependency tail got much longer. Then we're somewhat steady, trickling up a little bit for the next 3 to 4 years. And then last year, we saw a 3x increase in the average bill of materials. So we went from 670 to an average of over 2,000 items on a typical audit that we do. And when we looked at the data, what we saw driving this was a very high reliance on Python, Node, and Ruby as 3 technologies that are driving lots of software development today. And those ecosystems typically have a very high number of small packages. So when you rely on a Ruby or Python package, you're going to get a very long dependency tail on lots of small packages that you need to be able to compile your code and that your dependencies need to be able to compile their code. So if we look at this, we've got some logos on the right here that show you the various ecosystems that are popular today that are driving the very steep increase in the software bill of material. Now, the reason we asked a couple of the questions in the poll, and this is a little bit dated, this is based on a poll that we conducted last year. Lots of things changed in late 2020 and early 2021, but these are the numbers that we saw. So number one, based on our polling, 63 people that we asked in early 2020 did not have an open source policy. So in the case of our poll, 70% do. So that's great. We're very happy to see that people are being proactive, that they are writing down what their policies are. Kind of the next step beyond that would be, are people aware of the policies? Are your policies written down? Are they in a place where your developers have access to them? Do they understand what they mean? Do they understand what an open source license is? Do they understand what a security vulnerability is? Do they understand the difference between a security vulnerability in the code they wrote versus one based on an open source package? All right, so having a policy and then having guidelines and best practices on how to interpret it and how to deal with issues is really important. The second question we asked was, do you know who's in charge of your open source governance at your organization? And again, very small number, so almost close to 40% responded positively in that they do. In our poll here, again, we're sitting around 70%, so that's great. So that means that not only do you have a policy, but you know whom to direct questions to if somebody is stuck, doesn't know how to engage, doesn't know how to scan, and what to do with the scan results. So very encouraging to see. You know, we're pretty small sample size here, but in general, encouraging to see that the numbers are trending up. Very important and great to see that. The second point I really want to talk about are industry regulations. So there are lots of industries, industry groups based on what market segment they're in. So dealing with health and safety, dealing with technology, dealing with privacy, with payments. It's all of these organizations ultimately kind of boil down to 4 requirements that they're pushing for. Number 1 is maintaining an up-to-date software bill of material of all open source software components used in our applications, along with third-party software. Number 2 is, once you have your bill of material, once you know what you're using, following a process to be able to identify security vulnerabilities in those components. All right, so when you look at security holistically, you have security based on the code you write, but you also have security exploits based on code that you're pulling as dependencies. So it's important to make sure that you're handling both sides of that coin. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The third requirement is to be able to monitor, right? The element of time is really important in open source. Open source doesn't age well. So typically, even if you have a component that does not have any reported vulnerabilities, it is likely that in the future, somebody will find something. So it can't be a one and done. You have to have continuous scanning, continuous monitoring, continuous alerting, so that if a new vulnerability is reported, you understand where you're impacted across your business, and you can take actions to remediate that. And then the fourth requirement is, given all this, making sure you have a policy, making sure you have a process, making sure that you can get from a known discovery of a vulnerability to pushing a new release out, a service pack, a patch to your customers to give them a way to fix that issue and contain the vulnerability on their end. Now, the good news is, if you follow a continuous software composition analysis process, and we'll talk about what that means, you can satisfy all 4 of these requirements. So when the executive order hit on May 12th, I was asked to kind of put a quote together, right? What is my response to it, right? So this is kind of how I see the market today. So the industry has huge reliance on open source, which is a good thing, right? We don't want developers wasting time building non-innovative functionality. We want them working on new innovations and core competence of your companies. We also see a really sharp increase continuously over the years of dependencies being pulled into the build. So the magnitude of open source is increasing, and the frequency and the volume of security exploit continues to go up. Now, part of it is because there's just more eyeballs on it. A lot more people are looking. Part of it is that the industry just hasn't done a good job of proactively writing secure code. So there's exploits to be had. So if you look at these 3, we're kind of in a perfect storm for risks to the supply chain security. And kind of given that position, given the situation, what the US government did on May 12th, so the Biden administration, is they published the long-awaited executive order for improving the nation's cybersecurity. Now, currently, this is a mandate for anybody selling to the government. We fully expect this to go into the private sector in the future. Certainly, healthcare, finance, industries where there is lots of damage in case of exploits. We expect these kind of general principles to flow out of government and into private sector not too far from now. But if you look at the executive order, it kind of boils down to 6 things. Number 1, to improve the information sharing between federal government and private sector. Everybody's kind of running their own tools, their own process. the more communication we have, the more we kind of tackle this as an industry, the better outcome we're going to have. So being able to tear down the walls, the silos, and have better information sharing will go a long way towards that. Second is modernizing and implementing standards. Security standards, in the past, there's been some requirements, but for the most part, the companies have picked a framework under which they're going to manage security in their organization. And based on an agreement with our customers, they have set down the SLAs, the response times, what severity of a vulnerability is going to get addressed within which time frame. And it's been left fairly disjointed. So modernizing and implementing centralized standards will help to coordinate all the different efforts. The third is really focusing on software supply chain security. And this is a really critical step because you control your code. You don't have chain of custody of the code that comes into your company from your suppliers. And therefore, there needs to be a process where organizations can work together to ensure the software supply chain is secure. Very great analogy to hardware, right? If you look at a Boeing plane or a Tesla car, if anything ever goes wrong, every single part can be traced back to the original manufacturer. And we know who needs to fix it, what the issue is, whether there is a replacement supplier or you go back to your supplier for a fix and swap parts. But that is a mature supply chain that has lots of traceability and has lots of visibility and transparency in it. Software is not like that. And that's really the mandate, is to get software to be on par with the hardware supply chain. Fourth principle is establishing a review board, right? Having somebody accountable and responsible for driving standards, incorporating private sector into best practices, and making sure that there is a governing body over these requirements. Along with that, one of the outcomes is going to be a playbook, right? So what do you do when there's an incident? How do you respond to it? What are the best practices? And then in general, a real push to improve detection of incidents in federal government networks. And again, we fully expect that to bleed into the private sector. So when we look at it from our point of view, from open source, we really focus on this item, right? It's how do you improve software supply chain security? That is where open source lives. That is what makes the supply chain vulnerable, because your development team does not control every single source code file that ends up in your shipping product. So what does this mean? When we look at it, is we now have a blueprint, or we have the beginnings of a blueprint. So we have the mandate from the government. It's currently limited to government software, but again, we fully expect that to be broadened. So there's an executive order on improving nation's cybersecurity. We have a process. So Openchain, which is an open source community organization supported by Linux Foundation, what they have is a specification that is now an accepted ISO standard as of late last year, which is not so much a best practice, but it is governing principles and a specific specification to balance against whatever process you may be using to determine if it is adequate, right? So it is the controls behind whatever process you choose to adopt at your organization to make sure that your process is comprehensive, there's transparency, there's accountability, and there's training and education to be able to address security and licensing upfront, as well as to be able to respond to incidents. And we have formats. We have the software package data exchange format by Linux Foundation. That is also very close to becoming an ISO standard. We've got Cyclone DX, we got SWIT ID. So there's several formats that have been put in place as a way to satisfy the software bill of material requirement to communicate across organizations and help to start securing the software supply chain. Okay, so these are all great developments, long awaited, and really are giving a thrust to doing a better job around securing software applications. So let's talk a little bit about the software supply chain. It's very complex, just like it is in hardware. It is very atypical today where a company develops 100% of its functionality in its applications in-house. There is a huge use of open source community. Very often there's code that may be farmed out to a partner, to a vendor, to contractor, right? There may be different companies that build on top of each other's code to create a final application. There's code that you write, there's supplier code. So all of these are entry points into your software supply chain. And it's really important to understand that each one takes a different perspective to be able to control that. So when we kind of boil it down to what are all the different ways that code comes into your final product, there's kind of a line there, right? Everything to the left of the line, which we call the basic software bill of material, is based on your dependencies and your translate dependencies, the software packages that you use, the third-party container elements that you have. If you containerize your product, are you pulling open source into the containers you deploy? Are you dependent on containers already being in the environment into which your application is deployed? Build dependencies, right? Anything you statically compile. So anything that is what we call kind of a top-level package makes up the basic software bill of material. However, when we start talking about license compliance, vulnerability exposures, you really need to look at everything to the right, all the green diamonds. This is the more complete software bill of material. Typically, you want to be very up-to-date and very frequent, have a very frequent scanning process to handle the diamonds to the left. And you want to make sure that you have a safety net by doing more deep dives, more forensic analysis to look at the source code that you're pulling in. Are you pulling in full files? Are you pulling in fragments of code? Are your developers going to helper sites and pulling in sample code? Is that sample code clean? Does it have the same level of security practices on developers' code that you're pulling in as you do on your own development team? Right? These are things that need to be discussed with your security team to really understand it. Binaries, right? Binaries that don't come in through package managers. Are you pulling in multimedia files, codecs, images, icons, videos? There's considerations to be made there. Are you pulling in commercial code, right? There's non-open source SDKs, there's third-party code. All of this needs to be part of your software bill of material to have full transparency and full visibility into your risk. So let's talk a little bit about software bill of material. So the software bill of material is essentially a list of software parts that make up your application, right? So just like if you look at a plane, it's going to have wings and tail and software and wiring and different subsystems. Software is the same way, right? It's atypical, again, to have one big blob of code with a list of line items. There's hierarchy, there's dependencies, there's modules that are shared across applications, there are subcomponents, there's commercial code that has open source, there's open source code that has other open source. So it's a very complex ecosystem. And therefore, what we do is we have this term called inventory items. And an inventory item is a software part that is a bullet in your indented software bill of materials. So when we talk about inventory items, we are talking about the component and version that describes what the inventory item is, the selected license, open source license or proprietary license, under which you're using that component, a set of associated vulnerabilities that have been reported across multiple data sources. Then you have things like usage information. If you're dealing with open source and you're dealing with licensing issues, it is really important to understand, is this component distributed? Is it hosted? Is your application running in a private cloud? Is it distributed to customers? Is it an internally used application? Are you modifying code? There are certain license requirements that will become mandatory if you're modifying code. How are you linking to the code? In a lot of cases, this usage information is also important for security. Depending on, are you calling into a vulnerable function? Are you packaging your product in a way where a vulnerability can be exploited, or is it sitting in a dormant file that is not able to be accessed by the application? In that case, clean it up. You have dead items, get rid of it if it's not necessary. Third-party notices, right? This is an obligation to comply with developers of open source and maintain attribution to the fact that you're using code that they wrote. We then have tasks to manage the process and alerts and notifications to keep customers up to date on it. So if you look at kind of the life cycle of a software part, the part is created, meaning it is added to the bill of material. And this is done through a combination of disclosures, so upfront, along with scanning, along with importing potentially your vendor's bill of material into your products to make sure that you have every part represented. It can obviously be refined, right? Systems have limitations. They may be able to find a component, but not necessarily find evidence of a version. So there is an option for a person to come in and further refine the bill of materials. It needs to be reviewed. You need to understand, is it acceptable or not acceptable? Reviews, for the most part, can be automated. There's going to be cases where you find an unexpected item and you need to make sure to review that and refine your policies to increase automation in the future. You may choose to optionally remediate, right? It's important to understand that when you're running a software composition analysis process, you're not always the police. You're not the stick, right? You're not the enforcer. In many cases, you are providing information to your teams and letting them work with that to determine how to best address it. And then monitoring, also very critical. So I want to talk about education a little bit. So based on Forrester research from about a year ago, they looked at the top 40 US institutions and top 5 international computer science programs, and they found that they did not include open source licensing and security best practices as part of their curriculum. So this is critically important. You need to understand that most of your developers, as part of their education, did not receive this training. So it's a real burden on the industry to make sure that your developers are trained, to make sure that as you onboard people, or if you have employees that were onboarded when you did not have the training, to start including open source licensing and security training. So the poll we did here, 65% of you said that yes, you do have some level of training, which is great. Typically, I'm sorry, I flipped it. So 33% of you said that training is mandatory, 67 said that it is not. And that's actually a pretty high number. We typically see much lower than that. So critically important if you're going to hold anybody accountable to make sure that they understand what is being asked of them. So let's talk about highlights of a security program. So first of all, having some sort of committee internally to drive the program, best practices, policies, what does our team do? What happens if there's an incident report? What are the tools that we use to ensure software compliance in our own products that we build? Second is having a security policy. What tools? How often do we scan? How do we communicate? What are our remediation timelines? What are SLAs to our customers? Having some sort of research and advisory support team. If engineers have a question, if they don't understand a vulnerability, if they don't understand if it impacts them, who do they go to? What is their lifeline? Who helps them understand if a vulnerability is relevant? If it's not relevant, maybe it needs to be rescored. How do you communicate to a customer on relevancy, on exploitability? So having a specialized team to help is really important. Internal training, so we just talked about that. It is really hard to hold engineering accountable if they're, number one, not aware that they're being held accountable, and number two, not equipped with knowledge to be able to address this problem. So training is critical in this process. Then conducting security testing, and there's different types of application. So that means that you need to look at the code your team writes. That's typically done through static application security testing. That is scanning your code statically as it's being developed and finding vulnerability bugs in the code that is written by your teams. Having dynamic or pen testing, like what does the application look like when it's running? Can somebody inject a vulnerability or exploit a vulnerability through the web? Can I act as a user and perform malicious acts on the application? So you've got the static code being analyzed, you've got the runtime application. Software composition analysis is a static analysis on the code, but from an open source perspective. It helps you understand, are you bringing in vulnerable dependencies that whose code your team did not write that are increasing security exploit possibility in your product? And then, of course, manual security audits, periodic deep dives by an external organization that will come in and do a holistic security assessment of your product, of your process, of your deployment infrastructure, making sure that the entire ecosystem is secure, because anything with security, right, the weakest link is going to get exploited. So it's really important to look at the holistic problem, not just one element of the testing. And then finally, internal process. So what happens if somebody reports an issue? Do you have a process where you acknowledge the issue, you reproduce, reconcile results, build a remediation plan and containment strategy, do the implementation work to fix and test the fix, release it, and then revise your process? If you don't have a process as such defined and people trained on it, it's important to have one, because at some point everybody's going to get a call. And the better you can make this not a fire drill and have a planned process with roles, responsibilities, the better you can react and address the issue. So the final thing I want to talk about is, how does SCA fit in, and some tips. So when we talk about SCA and how it fits into security, we're really talking about automation and making sure that SCA is tightly embedded into the development process. You want to evolve from any sort of ad hoc audits or ad hoc scans into a more continuous program. Make sure it's plugged into your artifact repositories. That is typically the first entry point for external software. It's going to get checked into your repository and will get consumed during the build. In the IDEs, as developers are writing code in Eclipse or Visual Studio or whatever tools they use, give them early indicators that they just modified a dependency and there are negative consequences to that. Source management systems, right? When you check in code, there's a compliance event there. There's an opportunity to warn that your code check-in has implications that are non-compliant with your corporate policies. Build integration. integration into defect tracking. You want to make sure that you can go from a developer checking in code to an engineer getting a bug in their defect tracking system if your SCA scan failed based on your policy. So it's critical to have that in place so that nobody has to remember to manually do all these things. Otherwise, you end up in the Equifax use case. Make sure you're actively monitoring your bill of material, make sure alerts are enabled, and make sure that you have a way to initiate your remediation and patching process to address the vulnerability fix. And then finally, some tips. So how do you collaborate with your security team? So number one, get to know who they are. I mean, it's really critical. If you are working in a silo on the engineering team and you don't know who is responsible for security, who your CISO is, who your security research team is, get to know them because they can help you do the right thing the first time. So with that, you want to understand your corporate policies. You want to understand what tools to use, how often to use them, how to interpret results. What if you find an issue? What do you do? What are your communication guidelines? How long do you have to fix the vulnerability? Typically, there are going to be policies that will dictate what that frequency is. Understand what your role is. Are you being burdened with dealing with open source security as an SCA stakeholder, or are you burdened with contributing information to another team that is responsible for security? Very different dynamic, different relationship, and really important to understand what your role is in the process. Understand whom we can work with. So engineers are going to have questions, right? You can't expect everybody to be a security expert. So therefore, having a team as a safety net, as an advisory, who can help understand what is the impact to a specific issue. Is this issue actually exploitable in the AR application, the way it's deployed, the way it's used? If not, perhaps it needs to be rescored. Maybe the severity needs to be lowered. Maybe you need to think of workarounds where you either swap out a component, you upgrade a component. If that's not possible, maybe you have to write defensive code to limit the attack vectors. So your security team can help you understand that and can provide guidance on how to do it right. Next tip is really understand what to do if somebody calls, right? If somebody has an incident response against your software, whether it's hosted or distributed, what are you going to do? Who runs point? Who coordinates all the different teams that have to get involved? How do you keep the reporting party updated on progress, on your remediation plans, on when an expected patch is to be released? It's really important for somebody to own that process and for people to understand what to do so that you don't have a one-off response and it doesn't detract the team more than necessary from their day-to-day work. And then finally, just some additional considerations. So per the security, the cybersecurity executive order, it goes beyond just open source, goes beyond just your software supply chain. It really talks about a holistic view of security. So the whole point here is security can't be bolted on later on. So security needs to start with design discussions with your product management team. It needs to be part of your application requirements. It needs to be part of your continuous process. It can't be that you build your product, you build a candidate release, and now we're going to test for security. It has to be done early, has to be done often, has to be part of your team's culture. And the final point I'll make is don't forget that security goes beyond the application. There is the platform information, the environment your application runs in, your entire software development process, how you deploy products, how you build them, how you package them, how you deliver them to customers. Security encompasses all of these different processes, and it needs to be a holistic view top-down in the organization with training to back that up. Okay, so thank you for joining again. Happy to take any questions. So I'll turn it over to Charles and let's see if we have questions here.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It's a lot of great information on building your secure application strategy and how the software composition can tie into that. So Bill had a question about software composition analysis and commercial software. Mm-hmm. So and I saw you in slide, you did mention that plays in that, but yep. Is it a different ball game because it's commercial as opposed to a open source software?
So it's somewhat of a different ball game. It's more like same game but different aspects to it. So when I think of security, and we're talking just application security, right? We're not talking about network security or platform, but just the product. So when I talk about product security, I think of three things. Number one is the open source part. Are you pulling in vulnerable dependencies that put your product at risk? If you are, you need to be aware of it and deal with it either by upgrading, replacing, or coding around it. That's number one. The second part of this is your team introducing code against security best practices? That is SAST, that is static application security testing. There's plenty of vendors who do that. That is typically something that's closely correlated to SCA because typically you're scanning the same files. In SCA, you're scanning the code base, both that the build consumes to produce the product as well as the build artifacts that come out. In SAST, you are scanning your code before the build to see if there are any coding defects based on a repository of known bad coding practices. Right? So that's static part. Then what's critical is the dynamic part, right? Once your product is built and you've got the artifact that's either hosted or delivered to customers, how does the application function in a runtime environment? Is it exploitable? Can you log in? Can you have your permissions escalated? Can you inject malicious code through scripting into the database, right? So there's a whole set of practices and a whole set of rules that are fired by DAST tools to understand, is your product exploitable as it's running the way that your customers see it? So all three of those are critically important, and all of them have to be done. Otherwise, you have a blind spot to either your code, somebody else's code that came into your product, or the consequences of building your code and not properly securing it.
Okay. So, you went through the application security program, and we talked about open source and if you have a program office. So Kevin asked, how does that application security program fit with an open source program office? Are they separate entities? Are they the same? And again, you talked a lot about knowing who's doing things and interacting. So where do you think that fits?
Yeah, great question. So it's a really good fit for kind of my daily life because I'm in both. So it's a Venn diagram, right? And no doubt about it. So the open source program office or open source review board, their job is to operationalize your open source strategy, right? Which is a very kind of high level term, but what it really means is their job is all things open source to the organization, how to properly consume it, how to properly contribute to the open source community, if that's what your organization chooses to do, how to be a good partner, how to potentially influence organizations because you're going to rely on their code, you want to be around. So if you look at a Boeing plane, its service life 50 to 70 years, you don't want the software that's in the cockpit to go into life 2 years later. Right? So very often part of your strategy is going to be supporting these organizations from whom you use code and hopefully to whom you contribute code to make sure that they're well supported and around in the long term. The other part of an open source program office is to deal with the security element of open source. Right? So by using open source, you are opening yourself up to developers that are not working for you and not necessarily knowing what their best practices are around security, making sure that blends into your organization. So there's definitely an intersect between your security team, your network security team, your application security team, your open source program office, and there will be an intersect mainly in the way of policies. What vulnerabilities are critical? What's the line with respect to vulnerability scoring, vulnerability severity? What are our policies around what must get fixed in the current release versus the next release versus later down the road? All of that will be an intersection between your security team's best practices and your OSPO's policies that are pushed down to manage open source.
Okay. We have time for one more question. And Anil talked about, the uptick of security issues, and you brought a lot of them up with SolarWinds and the exchange issue. So do you think there's going to be an impact on team structures or responsibilities based on, the executive order, all of these high, high awareness events, and how will it impact on the DevOps life cycle environment?
Yeah, great question. So this kind of goes to, well, so what? So we have a mandate now. What do we do? So I guess a couple thoughts. Number one is your open source program office or whatever group of people you have that manage your open source use at your company and your security teams need to talk. It's critical that their intersection is coordinated and they are both given the same directives to the teams. So we have seen a shift that's starting to kind of move back now, but we saw a shift originally for SCA. Historically, was operated by a separate team of people. So it was usually a small team. It was usually very secretive work because you're essentially auditing your own product code. And it was done by a handful of specialists. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a big shift left to where now it is just part of day-to-day developers' job. It is their job to make sure that as part of their SDLC process, as part of their DevOps process, SCA is plugged into the tools that they use, right? So it doesn't need to be a separate application you use that's completely detached from their everyday life. So that's where you see SCA being plugged into the build, code check-in, automatic defects being created, and flowing into developers' backlogs. So as part of that, what we saw was that security typically held the budget for this type of work because they ultimately report back to either the CISO or CFO, and they're the ones that are kind of chartered with dealing with application security. But as more and more burden has been put on development, we're now seeing that budget shifted. And we are seeing engineering taking more ownership and accountability for doing this rather than just passing data to the security team. So my answer would be, to start, what you have to do is make sure that your process is not static, and make sure that your process is not manual, right? At a bare minimum, make sure that with each build, you're doing a scan. Now, you also want to make sure that your scanning is deep enough based on your risk profile. And companies will differ, teams within a company will differ, right? What Microsoft will do for the Edge browser is very different from what they would do for the Windows code, right? So it's important to understand what is your risk tolerance for each team. What is your overall philosophy? Are you driven by license compliance, by security compliance, by hybrid? Very different ways you would go about solving the problem. And as a bare minimum, get everything plugged into the build, get everybody scanning, get everybody trained up to a bare minimum level to at least understand how to interpret the scan results, and then whom to work with to remediate their issues.
Very good, Alex. And I think the bottom line is, if you don't have a application security strategy, you need to work on one, right? So,
Yep.
But again, I thank Alex for participating. Thank Revenera for sponsoring. And now it's time for me to announce the 4 $25 Amazon gift card winners. So for the winners, you will receive an email from the address that you registered this to the webinar with. So keep an eye out for that. So Yuri G, Matt N, LR, and Donato T. So again, you should be receiving an email that will give you information on how to collect your reward. And I thank everyone for attending. You will also, everyone who attends should get an email telling you where to find the on-demand version of this webinar. But if not, you can go to devops.com again and pull up the on-demand webinars. And you might want to check out the rest of those on-demands to see what is of interest. Alex, have a great rest of your day, and the same with all the attendees. And we'll see you the next webinar.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.